Hi, everyone. I'm Alex DeBranco, the Executive Director and co-founder of the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism. Welcome to the opening day keynote of the Joint Conference for Research on Male Supremacism and Conference on Right-Wing Studies, co-hosted by the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism and the Berkeley Center on Right-Wing Studies. We want to give a special thank you to the Southern Poverty Law Center for co-sponsoring today's keynote. I am honored to introduce Dr. Fleming, our keynote speaker today. Dr. Fleming is an internationally recognized expert on racism and anti-racism who empowers audiences to confront and challenge white supremacy. She is professor of sociology and Africana studies at SUNY Stony Brook. Dr. Fleming earned a PhD and a master's degree from Harvard University and graduated with honors in sociology and French from Wellesley College. Her research appears in leading journals such as Social Problems, The Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Poetics, Dubois Review, Social Science Research on Race, and Mindfulness. Her passion for speaking truth to power and promoting social transformation infuses her scholarship, writing, and teaching. Dr. Fleming is author of the book How to Be Less Stupid About Race on Racism, White Supremacy, and the Racial Divide, and also Resurrecting Slavery, Racial Legacies and White Supremacy in France. Dr. Fleming has been featured in a range of national and international media, including the Sunday Times, France 24, Newsweek, Vox, Black Agenda Report, the CBS Sunday Morning Show, The Root, NPR, and the New York Times, among others. She is currently writing a book about racial justice for young people, as well as a book about the cultural lexicon of social change. Dr. Fleming will be giving a talk today on revealing white supremacy. Thank you so much and welcome, Dr. Fleming.
I'm particularly excited to be in conversation with scholars who are working on white supremacy and other forms of oppression, in part because I think we are often having siloed conversations, those of us who are critical race oriented or grounded in other literatures like Black feminist thought, and scholars who sometimes work on right-wing movements and extremism. And this is a welcome change from that siloing of these conversations to actually have a convergence of perspectives. I also know that some of you are already conversant in literatures and critical race studies and Black feminist thought. And for those of you who are not, I do hope that perhaps by the end of your participation in this conference, if not my keynote, that you will be nudged a bit in our direction. Before I bring up my slides, I also want to just acknowledge the context from which I'm speaking and from which we are participating in this conference. So I'm literally speaking to you in the middle of a storm. Those of us on the East Coast have been experiencing since last night a tropical storm. But in many ways, we are experiencing the convergence of many different global storms. I don't know when that wasn't the case, but specifically now we have the global, of course, the global COVID-19 pandemic. And its disproportionate impact on Black communities and communities of color and Indigenous communities. And the unprecedented worldwide quarantine, which over the last months had seen 1 out of every 2 human beings on the earth confined to our homes. In this country, over 150,000 people have now succumbed to the virus. With unfortunately many more anticipated deaths. And we are of course living through the storm, and I think it's a welcome one, the storm of the global Black Lives Matter movements the resurgence of protest in the wake of the recent killings of George Floyd, but also Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Tony McDade, who was a Black trans person who was recently killed by police. So we are bearing witness, many of us, to the convergence of these storms. And we're also bearing witness to the reemergence and the storming of right-wing movements nationally and transnationally. Racist extremism and violent misogyny is on the rise. Of course, we have the recent killing of the son of federal judge Esther Salas by a violent male supremacist. We could mention, of course, the context of the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, Charlottesville, recent reports of white supremacists and extremists infiltrating, and I want to come back to that word perhaps later, but infiltrating police forces and military forces, not just here in the United States, but in Germany and elsewhere. And the word infiltrating is interesting when we think of societies that have been so ravaged for so long by what I'm going to describe in my talk as extremist ideologies and practices. So the list could go on, and indeed it does go on and on. And for some of us, these storms are not new. For some of us, the storms of white supremacy and violent extremism motivated by racial hatred. For some of us, extremism motivated by misogyny and violent forms of misogyny is not new. And this is the case both for those of us who study these matters and for those of us who live at the intersections of oppression and acknowledge that these forces are not only not new, but are also not marginal. That is, they are embedded within the center, embedded within the cultural and institutional frameworks and forms of violence within which we live and grapple. Those of us who have this awareness, we know that these storms of institutionalized violence and the everyday unmattering of lives are not relegated to the far right. And so I want to use my remarks today, and perhaps also the Q&A, to help us think through white supremacy, yes, as including, of course, forms of violent extremism that get demarcated as the far right, but in fact, that are also deeply embedded into our everyday, deeply entrenched into our cultural norms. That is, I want to suggest, specifically with regard to white supremacy, that white supremacy has been the cultural norm, not only of the United States, but also of Western socio-political and economic arrangements more broadly for centuries. And I think it's important to be able to contextualize the forms of violence and organizing that get recognized as far right and radical. It's important to contextualize that within this broader history and within this structural understanding of white supremacy and racial oppression. So with that said, with that context set, I'm going to now share my screen so you can see my slides, and we'll get into it. Okay. So my remarks are entitled Revealing White Supremacy. And as mentioned, I'm going to be focusing on white supremacy as a system of power and drawing particularly on work in the area of critical race studies, but also intersectionality and sort of key concepts in Black feminist thought as well. And I'm really excited to see the ways in which hopefully some of you will find resonance with some of the basic core concepts and assumptions in these literatures, and the work that you may be doing as well. So I won't say that much about me because Alex provided a really thorough introduction. I will say that I tend to refer to myself when I give talks as a wig snatcher of white supremacy, in addition to being a scholar and a writer. And if that term is new to you, you're about to find out what wig snatching is. But basically, what it means is that I make it part of my pedagogy and my scholarly activism to reveal the truth about systemic white supremacy and to try to debunk many of the myths and the enduring misconceptions that conceal white supremacy in its everyday forms. And so, yes, I've written some books that, so both of which address aspects of white supremacy in the United States and in Europe. Resurrecting Slavery was a book that came out of several years of field work in the Paris region, which centered the perspectives of French Caribbeans in particular, but French people of African descent more broadly, and interrogated the legacies of slavery and how those legacies are being debated and constructed today in the context of anti-racist mobilizations. My book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, which came out a couple of years ago, builds on my interest in critical race theory, but also narrates how I came to that literature and how I came to, as a scholar of racism, learn from critical race theory and learn specifically to reorient my understanding of white supremacy, my understanding of racism in conversation with critical race scholarship. And I'm going to explain more about that in a bit. Alex also mentioned a book I'm writing for young people, Rise Up, How You Can Join the Fight Against Racism. And this is a book that is about white supremacy, and it's about dismantling white supremacy for 10 to 14-year-olds, which is definitely new for me to write for an audience that young, but I'm also really energized by the challenge that entails. You can connect with me, of course, my website, but also on Twitter, where you can tweet me at alwaystheself. So this is the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. And I just want to say a word about a core concept in the book that will animate much of my remarks this afternoon. And one of those key misconceptions that I spend some time debunking is what I call the KKK fallacy. And the KKK fallacy simply is the notion that white supremacy is only or mainly white nationalism or white extremism. And this is certainly the conception of white supremacy that I grew up with. I would argue that it is the norm. It is the norm to imagine that white supremacy is, most emblematically demonstrated with white nationalist demonstrations, with neo-Nazis and so on. And I want to be clear, of course, these movements and groups are a part of white supremacy, but civil rights advocates and critical race scholars have long known and argued that the system of white supremacy is not actually maintained by extremists. It's maintained by everyday practices, everyday people, everyday institutions. And yet, for millions of people, it's a revelation, right, to sort of confront that reality of our social, political, and economic system. That is to confront the fact that white supremacy is not a thing of the past, that it's not only or even on the margins, but that it's actually deeply embedded into our society. I'm going to come back to sort of popular conceptions of white supremacy a little later, but I also just want to preview the fact that a systemic understanding of white supremacy even predates critical race theory. Some of the sort of leading figures in civil rights advocacy, people such as Martin Luther King Jr., who I'll invoke in a moment, had a systemic understanding of white supremacy as deeply embedded into our cultural practices, norms, and institutions. So the question is, where did this structural understanding of white supremacy go? How did it become marginalized? Why did it become common? Has it become common for people to misrecognize the ontology, really, of white supremacy, to take what is of white supremacy to be just the margins rather than the air that we're breathing or not breathing, our capacity to breathe or not breathe, being shaped by the structural realities of white supremacy that are still with us. And to be clear, I'm not placing all the blame for this concealing on right-wing studies, for example. But I would argue that unless you and we as scholars are making the connections, the critical connections between what gets framed as extremist movements and the extreme forms of violence upon which this nation were built, then we are concealing the structural realities of white supremacy. And I think we who would like to dismantle not just racial oppression, but other forms of domination, that we have a responsibility, collective responsibility to tell the historical and sociological truths about our society. Because unless we do that, we cannot change these forms of domination. So the KKK fallacy, again, is one of the ideas I seek to debunk early on, and how to be less stupid about race. But I also, again, as part of this project, attempt to explain my own journey as an intellectual and as a Black woman to learning about critical race work, learning about Black feminist thought, and integrating that into my sociological analysis and my political perspectives as well. So where are we headed? We are headed, I hope, toward a structural recognition of white supremacy. And I have to say that I have been pretty astounded, although let me clarify, I am not by any means a Pollyanna optimist, but I have been astounded to see in the last months, really in particular, but even in the last couple of years, a growing consciousness, a growing awareness on the part of everyday people and folks within the academy, a growing awareness that white supremacy is indeed not a thing of the past, but is actually that we're in the belly of this beast, right? That it's not just something that we can conceive of as over there or far, but that it's here and near. And I'm also very aware that this structural understanding of white supremacy remains in many contexts taboo. It's not uncommon when people and organizations reach out to me to invite me to speak, knowing full well that I do research and writing about white supremacy. It's not uncommon for organizers of events to say, you know, we're afraid of the backlash. Someone actually recently asked if it was possible for me to come give a talk about white supremacy without using the words white supremacy. Okay, so this is still the society in which we live. And by the way, would you like to guess how I responded to that query? Yeah, the answer was no. So because the project is to reveal it, right? And the project is to inquire into the taboo. And I do think that scholars of right-wing movements, scholars of white nationalism have an important role to play in debunking the notion that that's the only place where we find white supremacy, that we all can play a role in fostering the structural recognition. So earlier I was mentioning that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., among others, had a structural understanding of white supremacy. And I'm just sharing a bit of a quote from a book that came out in 1967, Where Do We Go From Here? And this is where Dr. King was debunking the notion that white supremacy was something that just sort of poor whites were implicated in. And he concluded that, in fact, in reality, the doctrine of white supremacy, that is the belief in white superiority and the legitimation of white dominance, that this doctrine of white supremacy was embedded in every textbook and preached in practically every pulpit, that it became a structured part of the culture. So this is 1967. Why is it in 2020 that this structural understanding of white supremacy is not more prevalent? Why is it that scholars who study racism, who get their PhDs and build their careers on doing work on communities of color, why do we not see this structural understanding of white supremacy prevalent even in that work? Now, to be clear, there are many scholars and activists who embrace this, sort of acknowledgement of our structural reality, but there are far too many who don't. And what I hope to do in my work and in my intervention is to help resurrect really what are core insights that Black people, not only sort of prominent activists and scholars, but everyday Black people have known for centuries, that we live in a white supremacist society. And that we cannot fool ourselves into thinking that white supremacist extremism is something that is only relevant to the far right. And if we center the knowledge and experiences of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, then we have to sit with this reality. We have to sit with the structural harms and the everyday harms and forms of violence that structural white supremacy produce in our lives. And so I want to contextualize my remarks with this throwback to Dr. King to show that this isn't even just from critical race theory. This is just sort of basic, common, but uncommon sense from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, and Brown experiences. So what is revealed and what is concealed with the words white supremacy? What is revealed and what is concealed? For many people still, when we ask what's white supremacy, it's very common that certain emblems and certain symbols and certain groups come to mind. And this is not just among academics, this is just sort of within the cultural norm. What you're seeing now are images from a Google search of white supremacy. Unsurprisingly, we're seeing Confederate flags. But you notice in the middle of your screen, we're also seeing white people protesting against white supremacy, right? This is an emergent phenomenon that we weren't seeing to the extent that we're seeing now, even a few years ago. But white supremacy still invokes images of swastikas, the KKK, neo-Nazis, and so on, and understandably so. And I want to be clear, I am not arguing that these movements and groups and ideologies are not part of white supremacy. They are. But you might also notice in the middle of your screen now that betwixt these Confederate flags, we also see the flag of the United States. And so when we think about why a man endorsed by the KKK and neo-Nazis worldwide could be not just elected, but still endorsed by tens of millions of US Americans, I think we have to really reveal this history of white supremacy that is not relegated to the margins, but is right in the center of the so-called American project. So in other words, it's far too easy to see white supremacy in Confederate emblems and monuments. And it's very important from my perspective that these Confederate monuments and emblems be challenged and I'm happy to see racist monuments being changed and toppled. But at the same time, as a critical race-oriented scholar, I argue we have to be willing to face it in the center, not just the margins, not just in the Confederacy, not just in neo-Nazis, not just in white nationalism, but to really reckon with the role of white nationalism in the American political project and in the concrete practices that undergird settler colonialism, indigenous genocide, the racialized oppression of Black people, the othering of people labeled as non-white or not white enough. And unless we're able to recognize white nationalism within the core of our institutions and within our embedded cultural practices that persist until the present day, that is, they are not a thing of the past, that white supremacy is still culturally, politically, and economically embedded within our society. If we can't face this, then we will not be able to do the important, urgently needed transformative work of uprooting the system of oppression. So telling the historical and sociological truths is a part of changing, or rather building the future that we would like to see. So what if the far is near? What if extremism is embedded within our norms? And I want to ask these questions without conflating, for example, neo-Nazis or the alt-right with people who do not endorse lynching, murder, and racial terrorism. But I'm also inviting you to think about the forms of extremism from which our nation was born and the forms of extremism that maintain it. And when I say extremism, I mean violence. I mean extreme forms of violence that get sort of brushed aside when we do not acknowledge the role of settler genocide, the role of violent torture of Black people in this country for centuries, when we don't recognize that racism, both as an ideology and as an institutionalized practice, that it is a form of extremism that has cost the lives of millions of people. So how do we make sense of far right or right wing extremism, given that the norm emerged from extreme forms of violence? How do we make sense of these things without conflating the phenomenon, but rather understanding how they're connected? This is what I want to put on the table, and I hope to engage with you in the Q&A and beyond. So to be clear, in my work, I argue that white supremacy is a violent system of power, and it is the system of power upon which our nation was built and is still maintained. And it's really the proof of the success of propaganda, and specifically white supremacist Western propaganda, that this acknowledgement of reality is often understood as radical itself, that it becomes labeled radical to acknowledge that our society was built on radical forms of violence, right? So the whitewashing of violence against Indigenous people, against Black people, against people racialized as other and inferior, that whitewashing is a part of white supremacy. It's a part of the system of ideological domination and hegemony, which frames Western civilization as civilization, which argues that the West represents progress. And so what can we do to uproot this ideological propaganda? I argue, and we'll come back to this at the end of my remarks, but I think some basic truth-telling that involves debunking our cultural and national and even transnational myths is required, and that this truth-telling has to center the perspectives and knowledge of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, and specifically Black women, coming back to intersectionality and Black feminist thought, which has developed in exciting ways alongside critical race theory, as I'll explain in a moment. So here is how I define white supremacy in my work. This is the definition or variation of it that I used in both of my books. So if you've read my work, this will sound familiar. But white supremacy is, I argue, the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. The social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. And I'd like to just briefly say a few words about the last phrase here, socially defined as white, because as a sociologist, it's extraordinarily important to acknowledge, right, that the construct of racial ideology, the idea that we can label each other in terms of racial categories, that these categories are understood to exist in a hierarchy of worth and value, and that whiteness is at the top of that hierarchy and everyone else is below. Part of what has changed over time with regards to this ideological construction is who counts as white. But what hasn't changed is the association. That is, over the last few centuries, what has not changed is the association between whiteness and resources, whiteness and political and economic power. And so the question of who counts as white, who counts as any racial category, right? This is going to be and has been an artifact of power relations. Critical race scholars and others, including sociologists who are oriented towards CRT approaches, tend to argue that the system of racism being a system of power, the role of ideology in that system is to justify it. So ideas about race and racial belonging are a part of the apparatus of white supremacy. So what I'm going to do in the remainder of my remarks is to kind of unveil the ways in which a critical race framework alongside Black feminist thought is really essential for revealing this system of power, for revealing white supremacy as not merely or even on the margins, but is actually the center of our social, political, and economic arrangements. And as I do this, as I turn to CRT and Black feminist thought, I also want you to think with a notion that I'm calling racial resonance, because in the context of this specific event, this conference, I think one of the interesting questions for us to grapple with is how and why do forms of racial extremism continue to resonate today amongst so many of millions of people, even though those who get defined as being in white nationalist movements are not the majority, right? And when I'm thinking of resonance, I'm also thinking of what resonates energetically, emotionally, intellectually, in the ways that acts of violence get framed. I'm thinking now of a story, I think it was just yesterday or 2 days ago, some of you might have heard, maybe we could talk about in the Q&A, but that there was a white man who had, I think, shot with an AK-47 within a store, perhaps, I think, where he was told to put on a mask. He opened fire, then he opened fire on police officers, and this man was arrested alive. And the ways in which Dylan Roof, for example, some of you probably recall that after his domestic terrorism, not only was he arrested alive, he was taken by police officers to get a hamburger at Burger King. Racial resonance, when the Black body, the Black being, resonates in the white imaginary, not only as less than, but as threatening. Why don't we see that resonance with white nationalists? Well, of course, it's quite straightforward. That is that white nationalists and white supremacist extremists do not pose an existential threat to the white majority. And so we don't see the kinds of urgency, the kinds of fear, the kinds of violence directed towards practitioners of white nationalism in a country built on white nationalism. And I think that we need to sort of really be clear about that, that we're dealing with the reverberations of cultural practices, of affect too, transgenerational affect and emotions that get framed as fear and loathing of Black people and people of color, and framed as framed on the flip side as reverence for whiteness and white authority. So racial resonance, I think, is something that we could think about. Just have up on the screen to orient this idea. This is just a definition from the Oxford Dictionary. But what does it mean to resonate? That it means to be filled with deep, full, reverberating sound, to evoke or suggest images and memories, to meet with agreement, to produce electrical and mechanical resonance. I'm thinking of how, as I write about in How to Be Less Stupid About Race, so many of Trump's supporters, particularly in the lead up to the 2016 election, they spoke in glowing terms of how they loved the fact that Trump tells it like it is, that he resonated with them and their values. What is this racial resonance? Can we understand it without a historical framework, without a critical race framework? I would argue, no, we can't. When we see images like this is from a march of the KKK in the early 1920s, and we wonder why, about a century later, we have a man who promotes racist policies and practices endorsed by the KKK and by tens of millions of Americans. I think we need to look at the historical context and the place of white nationalism within the nation, right? Because white nationalism was not the margin, it was the political agenda of the United States for most of its history. And some might argue it still is, although in different forms. I think it matters that Trump on the left is flanked by the United States flag that is being held by these white nationalists, right? So when we sit with this history, we have to ask the question of what is revealed and what is concealed when we pretend that the image on the right is extremism rather than the ideas and even the values that have been at the core of the US political project since its inception. When Dr. King mentioned earlier, described white supremacy in this way as deeply embedded in the culture, I mean, I spend months in my courses at Stony Brook University lecturing on what this looks like, and years writing about it, but I just wanted to put up on your screen a painting from the early 1800s by not early 1800s, but the 19th century by John Gast, called American Progress. And part of what this painting shows in very stark and in many ways obvious terms is white progress embodied in this larger than life white woman, literally moving across the territory with indigenous people in her shadow, rendered here as caricatures. And what is she bringing? She is bringing light. She is bringing knowledge. She is bringing technology. She's bringing transportation. She is a colonizer who is entitled to run these people off of their own land, in their homeland, and to invoke whatever means of violence is required to remove these people. This is just one painting, but it vividly illustrates the ideology of manifest destiny as well as the ideology specifically of white supremacy and white nationalism that has been framed as patriotic for centuries. That to be a good American meant and still means, really, to adhere to this project of white entitlement and of national entitlement to indigenous land, to resources that belong to other people, and to justify it all in the name of progress. This is emblematic of the kinds of structural, ideological forms of white supremacy that have been deeply embedded in our society. So to sum up, before I get into the latter portion of my remarks and wrap up, white supremacy, I'm arguing, is a deadly form of extremism that entails, among other things, indigenous genocide, land theft, and by the way, land theft is not a thing of the past, it's still happening and still being contested, the enslavement, subjugation, and torture of Black people, the unmattering of people labeled as non-white, racialized forms of economic exploitation, radical forms of harm, and ecological destruction. We could talk about the links between white supremacy and the Anthropocene. And perhaps in the Q&A, those of you who have interests in the environment and in environmental racism might engage on the topic of the Anthropocene. So what is the role of scholarship? What is the role of advocacy in addressing this? I remain very, very inspired by the work of Ida B. Wells, who dedicated much of her life to standing up against white supremacist torture and violence and lynching. And she said, among other things, that the way to right wrongs is to turn the light of truth upon them. And when we conceal white supremacy as a structural reality, we are reinforcing that structural reality. So conversely, when we can be a part of revealing forms of domination as they really are, not as the propaganda and the hegemonic discourses would lead us to believe, then we can be a part of righting these wrongs and building the kind of society and ways of being and relating that we would like to see. As we move towards the end of my remarks, I also want to just remind you of the ways in which critical race theory is intertwined with intersectionality, intersectionality being a term that Kimberly Crenshaw innovated, and that is about recognizing how forms of domination like racism, white supremacy, class inequalities, gender oppressions, ableism, and so on are intertwined in the experiences of marginalized people and Black women specifically. And I think we need to move Black women and girls into the center of scholarship and academic and public discourse around white supremacy. This is an image of Ayanya Stanley Jones, who was killed by police a few years ago while she was sleeping in a raid in her home. And again, the image of white supremacist progress, running people out of their home, killing people in their homeland, resonates with what happened to Ayanya Stanley Jones. And here we see also this really bittersweet, heartbreaking image of this beautiful Black girl who is no longer with us, flanked by the image of these white Disney princesses. We need to center Black women and girls, the killing of Breonna Taylor recently, in the way that we understand white supremacist violence, even when that violence doesn't call itself by its name. That we need to understand things such as pregnancy-related deaths and the risk that Black women have dying while giving birth. We need to understand these phenomena within the context of white supremacy and how it intersects with gender oppression and class oppression. On your screen here, I just have some call outs of the context that I mentioned earlier that we're all living with and thinking with and grappling with and trying to survive. But to center the perspectives of Indigenous people and the historical experiences of Indigenous people with regards to white supremacy means that we need to find resonance in and understanding in why Navajo Nation has really been on the front lines of succumbing to COVID-19, even as Indigenous people are still being marginalized and dispossessed through the genocidal forces of settler colonialism. The Black Lives Matter resurgence taking place now also in the context of these racialized health disparities, right? These phenomena cannot be understood, I argue, without reference to the broader, deeper history of white supremacy. As we get ready for the Q&A, I want to also leave you with some concrete numbers so that when we talk about the structural realities of white supremacy, you have a clear idea of what I mean, because I'm not just talking about ideology. I'm talking about the ways in which our society is structured in ways that associate whiteness with concrete resources. So let's begin with economic dominance. On average, white households hold 12 to 13 times more wealth than African-American families. And one of the statistics that really just blew my mind that you can see on your screen is that when Barack Obama was president, so when we had a Black president, right there in Washington, D.C., white households had 81 times more wealth than their Black neighbors when we had a Black president. When so many people, particularly white people, but not only, but so many people were ready to believe that we had entered a post-racial moment, right? The racial wealth gap expanded and continues to expand. This is data from the late sociologist Eva Pager's work, the classic paper, The Mark of a Criminal Record. And what you basically see here in this article published in the American Journal of Sociology is that white men with a criminal record have an easier time getting a job offer than Black men without a criminal record. The ways in which white supremacy continues to thrive on the demonization of Blackness, right? The ways in which that demonization resonates with centuries of racial oppression and othering and unmattering. That's what I think is at stake when we conceal white supremacy as a system of power, that we have to actually do the reverse and reveal it and understand these dynamics as still with us today. In the realm of politics, whites represent 90% of all elected offices, despite only being between 60 and 77% of the population, depending on whether you're counting Hispanic or non-Hispanic whites. But 90% of elected offices, white men, only 31% of the population, 65% of all elected offices, 95% of all elected prosecutors are white. And when we think of this demographic dominance, we could also look around in academia, as I often do as a Black woman scholar, and see that academia itself remains demographically dominated by whites and white men in particular. Right-wing studies, I looked at your websites. I have looked up your work. Not many people of color. And I think that this conference and event, as a result of the intentional work of the organizers, is an outlier in that respect, in terms of centering the perspectives of people who have traditionally not been involved in conversation with you. So the white supremacist mainstream, what are we talking about? This is just some call outs for us maybe to animate the Q&A, but I'm talking about settler colonialism and racial capitalism, right? And capitalism being so intertwined with white supremacy. But we could go down the list and look at how citizenship itself has been and continues to be hegemonically understood in terms of whiteness. Our nation's very first law relative to becoming a naturalized citizen the Naturalization Act of 1790 limited naturalization to free white persons explicitly. It was explicitly white supremacist. And it actually even excluded white women from being able to naturalize. They had to naturalize through their husbands. Land theft, real estate, business leases, the Homestead Act, which was a handout from the United States government of land stolen from indigenous people and given almost exclusively to whites, hundreds of millions of acres of land that are still bound up with the racial wealth gap that we've just talked about. The Reconstruction era and Jim Crow, of course, scientific racism and eugenics, which in the context of COVID-19 and the ways in which racist ideology and racist dog whistling has been used to stigmatize communities of color and sort of throw up the government's hands. There's nothing we can do if it's being framed as disproportionately impacting Black people and people of color. Eugenics for me is something, and I've seen other commentators and folks sort of point out, Malthusian logics as also very much at stake in the way that COVID-19 is being treated and framed by policymakers in the Trump administration. And finally, the notion of affirmative action for whites. Ira Katz-Nelson's work on this topic, and particularly the racist implementation of the New Deal and the GI Bill are really essential for understanding the ways in which the United States and its form of white nationalism has always been about creating handouts from the government, not even to most white people, but especially to the wealthiest of whites. But yes, that there's also the reality that the white middle class came to be largely as a result of government handouts from which Black people and people of color were largely excluded. And Ira Katz-Nelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White, is really crucial for understanding that. So in closing, I want to say that if we're going to shift, right, the centuries-long cultural norm of white supremacy, that we have to be willing to name it. We have to be willing to understand that it's not something over there, it's something right here, we're in the belly of the beast, and that naming it is deeply connected to dismantling the system of oppression. So what is the role of right-wing studies? I'm going to suggest for your consideration a few concrete recommendations, 4 ideas that I really welcome your engagement around. Because I do believe that events like these and scholarly interventions like the ones that are taking place at this conference have an important role to play in shifting both scholarly and public understandings of white supremacy so that we see the connections and the resonance between forms of violence that get framed as the far right and what really has been the cultural and institutional center of the United States. So the first recommendation is to sort of rethink the ways in which the rise of far-right extremism gets framed in academic and media discourses. So by that I mean considering whether terms like resurgence would be better than rise or in complement to rise. That is to say, the idea of resurgence allows us to recognize that these movements and these forms of violence are not new and are connected to prior forms and prior policies, but not even just prior, still existent. I was reading something from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it was sort of acknowledging that we're seeing that white supremacists today want a return to the America of the past. And I think we need to ask whether the America of the past is really the past. But again, this first recommendation is to sort of think about our use of language and to sort of think about the ways in which we can acknowledge the connection between what's happening now and what has been happening for centuries. I should also say that this question of temporality and how we frame temporality is one of the core intellectual concerns of my first book, Resurrecting Slavery. And perhaps we could talk more about that in the Q&A for any of you who have an interest in temporality. My second recommendation would be to engage with literatures that explicitly center the knowledge of racially marginalized people, including critical race theory, but also Black studies, Indigenous studies, and intersectional thought. One of the great things about critical race theory, and it sort of being an interdisciplinary body of work that came out of civil rights legal activism, but CRT theorists engage in narrative storytelling and centering the stories of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. And I would ask you, how much do you do that in your work on right-wing studies? And I know for some of you, this is on your agenda, but if it's not, I would ask why, and if that's something that you might change. A third recommendation, I think, is particularly of importance for right-wing studies is community-based research. Community-based research to disrupt the dynamics of white supremacy in academic scholarship. If you're doing work on right-wing studies and you're not asking communities of color and Indigenous communities and Black folks how your work could contribute to their well-being and how you might learn from their knowledge, then I wonder what you're doing. I wonder if your work can actually disrupt white supremacy, if it's not in conversation explicitly with the communities that are targeted by white supremacist ideologies and practices. And finally, to go back to the question of demographics and its interrelation with domination, I would ask what can be done to diversify your ranks. The field and discourses, and mine included in sociology, remain dominated by white men. And if you aren't committed to changing this, then again, I would ask, what are you doing? and to ask, really what bold actions can be taken within your academic institutions, within your programs, within your departments, to transform not in a broad abstract way, but specifically the kind of academic work in communities you're doing to boldly include people who have been historically excluded. So with that, I would like to end with this. I'm not an optimist, but it is an optimistic note because it is actually true. I do believe that we do have the power to end forms of domination, including white domination. Not that it will be easy, not that it will happen in our lifetimes or even our children's lifetimes, but that we have the power to uproot and dismantle systems if we are willing to recognize them for what they are and to engage in the bold work of transformative change. And what will it take? What will it take? Because I'm very adamant in my work that there is no magic wand that will do away with white nationalism or white supremacy. So what will it take? Well, the good news and the bad news is that it will take changing everything. Everything. 1964, James Baldwin said the following. He said that in order to accommodate me, in order to overcome so many centuries of cruelty and bad faith and genocide and fear, all the American institutions and all American values, public and private, will have to change. So what does it mean to sit with that from James Baldwin, who I think we just celebrated his birthday a couple days ago, to sit with that truth from James Baldwin, that we do have the power to will a new world into being, but that new world is not going to look like this one. It's not going to look like a return to any sense of normal. It's going to have to look like a new normal, because the norm has been white supremacy, the norm has been capitalist oppression, the norm has been patriarchy for millennia, the norm has been oppression. And if we're going to undo these forms and uproot these forms of oppression, we have to tell the truth about them. We have to face them for what they are. And we have to sit with the brutal reality that our entire reality must change. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to now turn to our moderator, and I very much look forward to engaging with you in the Q&A.
Thank you so much for that really engaging presentation. We already have a number of questions in the Q&A function, and I invite people to continue submitting them. I will summarize questions that are related to one another in delivering them so that we can cover as much ground as possible. I'm going to start with a question that I had in mind and was asked in part in the Q&A as well, picking up on this concept of the norm, as you were just discussing, and of language and right-wing studies. There's a controversy in right-wing studies where some scholars are very critical of the use of the term far right or extremist right or radical right. There was some research a couple of years ago that centrists actually hold very anti-democratic beliefs. Mm-hmm. And there's also the issue of false equivalency, that radical becomes a negative term in either direction. So I think it would be great if you could speak a little bit more to what your perspective is on that issue and the kind of, terminology that we should be using in that respect in particular.
Thank you for that question and for sharing with me this controversy that I don't know about because I'm not in your field, but this controversy, around the term far right and radical right. Without, sort of having delved into that literature, I would just say, I don't personally like the terms far right for a number of reasons. One is, similar to what Alex, you were suggesting some of the critics argue, which is that many centrists hold undemocratic beliefs. Many people in the center, whatever that is, hold hateful beliefs, could, in some cases and in some social contexts even, embrace fascism. And so, to the extent that as a scholar of racism, I'm well aware that, racist views are fundamentally undemocratic, are fundamentally anti-human, that are promoting unfreedom, that these views are widespread, and that everyday forms of white supremacist violence are widespread. So, I tend to feel, if not disinterested, then also a bit offended and bemused by those who relegate, extreme forms of racism to the far right because, well, for all of the reasons that I spoke about for the last hour. So I do think in attention to the question of what are the political consequences and the moral consequences of the ways in which we frame the problems we work on, I think that is worth engaging. And particularly the last point that you brought up, this notion that the term radical then gets conflated and, sort of stigmatized as a bad thing. Yes, I think that's a problem. As someone who just read a quote from James Baldwin that said that everything needs to change, that is a radical idea because that is a radical refashioning of all that is. Or all that has come to be in any case in terms of our political, social, and economic institutions. And there's also the way in which Black radicalism or Black radical thought and simply Black civil rights and human rights advocacy have been long framed as extremist by the regressive forces in our nation. So going back to Dr. King, right, someone who is very well known for having promoted nonviolence, was essentially labeled as a terrorist threat by his own country. So there's this way in which, you know, which forms of radicalism get taken seriously, get viewed as an actual existential threat. To what extent do generative forms of radicalism then get drowned out because of the ways in which the terms get used and appropriated by scholars? I think these are all really important questions. So I'm glad that there is a controversy because I think that these terms need to be grappled with.
Great, thank you so much. So we have a couple of questions related to distinctions between discussing white supremacy in the United States and Europe. We have most of our scholars are coming from either the United States and Canada or Europe who are in this conference, and it's about 50-50. So there's a lot of interest in what those distinctions might be. And I know that this is an area that you have also looked in particular at both the US and European context. And specifically, one of the questioners brought up differences between, for instance, exploitation in the United States of Black peoples through slavery, Jim Crow, prison industrial complex, and exploitation from European nations forced on colonized nations, and thinking about colonization and how we discuss white supremacy.
Great, thank you. Sip a little coffee to stay awake, y'all. So I love this question. And this is something that I, for unsurprising reasons, I'm really interested in how we think through the interconnections or distinctions, both and, between white supremacy as it manifests in the United States and how it manifests throughout the West more broadly and throughout the world more broadly. I'd say a few things because I know I need to get to other questions, and I literally could lecture on this and talk about it with you for days. But first, I would say that the historian George Fredrickson has been so helpful for me in terms of, and influential for me in terms of my own framework for understanding global white supremacy, and the critical race philosopher Charles Mills, who I write a lot about in How to Be Less Stupid About Race, because his work played a huge role in opening my eyes to a structural understanding of white supremacy. But these two scholars, just to name two, George Fredrickson and Charles Mills, really have a lot of intellectual resources for dealing with the complex interrelations between white supremacy across national contexts. And so the one notion that I would emphasize that is present in both of their works is this acknowledgement of white supremacy as a global Western project. So from that perspective, yes, we need to look at the specificities of national cases, and particularly the historical emergence of white supremacy in different national contexts, because those histories are distinct. So to take one example, throughout my talk, you heard me say that white supremacy is the basis, one of the bases upon which the United States was built. In fact, white supremacy in this territory predates the national emergence of the US. That is, it was present. It became part of the institutional forms of violence and the political practices of settler colonialism before we even got to the historical emergence of the United States. Whereas for Western nations, right, there is a much longer history of ethnic belonging and forms of, well, I don't know, we could have a longer discussion about the modern advent of nationalism, but we can say for sure that there's a much longer history of ethnic boundaries, that predate Western colonialism and imperialism and chattel slavery. And so like my work on France, looking at the legacies of slavery in a place like France, one of the things I write about is how the United States gets framed as a paradigmatic racist nation in a lot of the global discourse, particularly among Europeans, and this kind of constant comparison which turns into flattery for European nations. And I think we're seeing a more widespread challenge to that in the context of global uprisings among Black people and people of color in European and Western nations rising up against racism in those societies. But very often the US gets framed as that's the really racist, you know, society, and we by comparison are so much better, so much more enlightened, even though those of us who study racism in Europe are often baffled by these claims. But I think that that kind of claim, that it's staked on an understanding of white supremacy that rejects the global, that does not acknowledge the ways in which transnationalism was a part of the emergence of white supremacist Western hegemony. That when you look at even something as specific as the emergence of scientific racism in those discourses, what you trace are racist ideas, claims about categories and belonging that circulated among Western thinkers, Western intellectuals, Western travel writers, and others who through literally moving across the world and crossing borders, but also exchanging ideas as part of a broader Western project, which was also complicated by the internal ethnic antagonisms and forms of violence that Europeans have been enacting upon each other for a very long time. But so we're dealing, white supremacy is at its root a global project. And George Fredrickson's book, Racism, A Short History, does a great job of kind of tracing the emergence of white supremacist ideas and practices in Europe, you know, especially through his, and I'm going to stop in a moment, but his historical narrative is one that argues that anti-Semitism, sort of racial anti-Semitism, grew out of anti-Judaism in Europe. Looking at developments in Portugal and Spain in particular, and that racialized anti-Semitism emerged before anti-Blackness and is a part of this, you know, sort of Western cultural heritage of a belief in white superiority that became so central to not just the United States, but claims of Western superiority and civilization more broadly. So Fredrickson's work traces those developments in Germany, well, first sort of globally, but then through these case discussions of Germany, the United States, and South Africa. And lastly, Charles Mills's work, of course, the famous racial contract, but also some of his more recent writings. There's a piece he wrote a few years ago on global white ignorance. And there have been a number of other publications where he's written about global white supremacy. So all that to say, I think we need to and can pay attention to the distinctions of how white supremacy emerged historically in different national contexts, but that we also have to take a step back and acknowledge that it has been for centuries a global project.
Great, thank you so much. You touched on intersectionality in the course of your talk, and I would love to hear more about how we should be thinking about issues such as cis male supremacy as they intersect with white supremacy. And also, you just mentioned anti-Blackness and how the analytical use of other terms related to white supremacy, like anti-Blackness, and how scholars should be incorporating those kinds of concepts and analyses into their work.
Yes, thank you for the question about intersectionality and cis male supremacy. Yes. You know, I also want to contextualize my remarks by saying that one of the things that I'm very transparent about, and I tell, when I used to, before COVID, actually go to conferences and go and deliver keynotes in person, I would always, tell audiences that people assume that a Black woman scholar who writes about these issues, that I sort of, kind of came out the womb with a Black power fist, quoting Angela Davis, and that's not the case. I had to learn as a Black woman to value Black women's knowledge and forms of knowledge, which include Black feminist thought and its more recent iteration of intersectionality. But as I do, there's a chapter of the book called Listen to Black Women. I argue that not just me, I'm just pointing out that many people have shown the roots of Black feminist thought in early work from folks like Ida B. Wells to Anna Julia Cooper. We could go back to Sojourner Truth and many others. So it's not new in that way. But so intersectionality is so important because if we're only focused on white supremacy and racialization, without inquiring into the ways in which other axes of domination are intertwined with white supremacy, then we won't be able to really understand the way that power works, not just in our society, but globally. I also think it gets into a longer discussion when we think about the historical trajectory and even genealogy of these forms of domination, right? Because white supremacy is a relatively new system of power. One of the things my students sometimes say is when they come into now my virtual classroom, but when they would come into my classrooms, they, would admit that many of them sort of thought white supremacy always existed, or that, the idea that white people were superior, that it's like ancient, and it's not, it's new. It's only several hundred years old. But the history of patriarchy is millennia long. And even that has a history, right? We had a world before the hegemony of patriarchal domination. The specific history of capitalism, I think what's important to note, and we could turn to people like Eric Williams and others, C.L.R. James, and Cedric Robinson, for an understanding of racial capitalism and the ways in which white supremacy and anti-Blackness are really bound up with the expansion of the capitalist mode of production. So intersectionality allows for us to have these conversations and to unveil the complexities of the way in which power is deployed and lives are made to matter or not matter, and people are exploited along shifting axes of power. I think maybe I'll end there. I mean, I've already said a lot, but I think we have to, I like the way you phrased it, cis male or cis male and white supremacy. We have to bring gender oppression and the oppression of trans people into that conversation. We have to bring ableism into that conversation, class oppression, and the list goes on. We can't have, in other words, a simplistic, superficial understanding of power. And the more that we focus on the lived experiences of people who live at these intersections, the more that our work, our scholarship, and our politics can be informed by the knowledge that such people have. And that's the critical insight of Black feminists like Kimberly Crenshaw, but also Patricia Hill Collins and others, that people who get framed as marginalized, they're also sources of knowledge.
This next question also comes from that intersectional lens, speaking about specifically Breonna Taylor, who was shot and killed by police, who you mentioned, and another young Black girl who was shot and killed by police, and what is missing, in your opinion, from the discourse about Black girls' violence and white supremacy?
Well, what's missing is that from my observations, I don't and you tell me if I'm wrong, is it common for scholars in right-wing studies to center the experiences and forms of harm that characterize the lives of Black women and girls? Is that like a major focus of right-wing studies?
Right-wing studies is certainly doing terribly in that. This question came from someone who is in the field of developmental psychology, and so I think she was interested more generally in the discourse, not the right-wing studies discourse, which
Got it. Okay.
the discourse just doesn't exist at all in right-wing studies.
Right, and I think it doesn't exist at all in too many contexts, right? So there are too many academic and sort of popular contexts where racism gets framed as something that happens to Black men and boys, which of course it is. But you know, folks like Andrea Ritchie, who wrote a great book, Invisible No More, Angela Davis and others, again, working in the tradition of Black feminism, and as well as Kimberly Crenshaw's Say Her Name hashtag and invocation, right? These invocations are necessary because all too often conversations about racism are not intersectional, that they don't explicitly engage the ways in which Black women, Black girls, Black non-binary people, Black people who are not cisgender, Black people who are not straight, that conversations and discourses around racism have not fully acknowledged the existence of these people in the Black community and in our communities more broadly. So I think to the extent that all of us have spheres of influence, professional influence and social influence, to the extent that we can center the experiences and perspectives of these marginalized and often overlooked perspectives, then we can be a part of shifting that. I hope that answers your question, or at least begins to. And if it doesn't, come holler at me on Twitter.
Thank you so much. So this question is related to what you mentioned before about the current demonstrations related to the police killings of so many Black men and women and trans people, and that you have some optimism around the kind of changes that have happened with people in the United States. They're using the phrase systemic racism, and this different kind of attention. Can you speak a little bit more about what you would recommend in terms of maintaining and intensifying this development? Because especially in right-wing studies, one of the things we're constantly seeing is, you know, things happen like something that seems like it should be really shocking in terms of white supremacism, and then within a couple months, people have forgotten and there's a new normal, and they're not interested anymore.
Yeah, I love that question because it also goes back to the idea of temporality, which I mentioned earlier as being something I'm really interested in a whole variety of ways. But what I mean by temporality in this case is what I sense in the question is how can we be intentional about shaping the future and not allowing the future to be one in which these topics, these interests, these concerns, these forms of harm, these forms of oppression are relegated to the past, that is our present now, or forgotten. And what I have been telling folks who have been raising this kind of question is that I think at this particular moment of higher than usual attention, and also an attention span that's going to dissipate, I think this is the moment to work on institutionalizing some of the things we'd like to see. So as opposed to organizing one-time interventions or symbolic gestures that occur one time, that activists, advocates, scholars, everyday folks, we have to be working right now to create institutionalized actions that you know, we can look up not just 6 months from now, but 6 years from now and see that we started something that is still going on. Whether those interventions are about specific policies in our communities and our institutions, whether they're about ways of moving concrete material resources to Black communities, Indigenous communities, and communities of color, whether it's about institutionalizing opportunities for ongoing learning, because we know, the huge boon in the diversity and inclusion industry and all this anti-bias training. We know from the research that such trainings don't work. But what may work, and some of the empirical research suggests, and it depends on what you mean by work, but what does have more of an impact are long-term opportunities for people to learn about some of what you're discussing in this conference, learn about some of these power dynamics and historical contexts and so on, but then leverage that knowledge into concrete action. And we all can play a role in trying to create those opportunities for institutionalizing anti-racism and social justice initiatives. But I think that window that we're in right now is a unique one. And so we have to be very mindful about kind of that temporal intentionality. How can we start things now that will still be going on months and years into the future?
So we just have a few minutes left with you, so I wanted to send it back to you and ask if there's anything else as closing remarks that you would like to add that you haven't had a chance to discuss so far.
No, I think I've had the floor for a long time, but I would say that I want to just really express my gratitude to everyone who's engaging in this conference, who have put on the conference, done the hard work of organizing it and creating this. And I hope that, I think, what is this, the second year that you've done something like this? Maybe last year was the first effort, is that right?
Yeah, this is the second conference on right-wing studies and the first conference for research on male supremacism.
Yeah, so, you are a part of an institutionalization of some important transformative work. And I would just really encourage you, all of you who are a part of making this event possible, to keep on keeping on, that what you're doing is important, and that the knowledge that's being exchanged and shared, that it be leveraged into bold, concrete action. And that you be encouraged, because it's not easy to do this work. It's not easy for any of us. It's particularly not easy for Black people and people of color, but really anyone who does the work of revealing and unveiling and challenging white supremacy and other forms of oppression. You could be a white man doing this work, and you're going to run up against opposition, and you're going to have a price to pay. And so it's really in building community and solidarity that we can sustain what it is we're trying to promote in terms of positive and uplifting transformation. So again, I told you all I'm not an optimist in kind of the Pollyanna sense, but I am optimistic about our capacities for really meaningful change when we acknowledge that we have that capacity and we use it. So thank you again so much for your engagement. I hope that we continue to be in conversation, and I'm really excited for the rest of your conference, and I wish you the best for the rest of the week.